Okay, I'm going to go next to our final presenter, Charles Holman. And Charles Holman is an amazing individual. Many of us love to follow his social media and see all of the incredible things that he's doing, but he is a remarkable person. So let's talk about Charles Holman. Charles Holman is going to talk about how DNA testing enabled me to learn the history of my family and their escape from slavery. He is a Baltimore, Maryland-based civil rights attorney. A 19-year-old graduate of the University of Michigan, at 22, Charles became one of the youngest attorneys in Michigan history. His past positions include service as a civil rights trial attorney at the U.S. EEOC, Assistant United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, and Senior Trial Attorney at the Civil Rights Division, U.S. Department of Justice. In the 1990s, he prosecuted hate crimes involving the burning of Black churches in the US South as part of a presidential joint task force. He has received commendations from both the US Attorney General and Director of the FBI for his work. A past member of the NAACP National Board of Directors and Commissioner of the State Bar of Michigan, Charles is a member of the Sons of the American Revolution and serves as Chancellor General of the First African American Families of English America. He has spent decades researching his family history and credits his meetings with the late Alex Haley for starting him on his lifelong journey to discover his roots. Please welcome Charles Holman.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right, wonderful. I was just saying how nice it is to be with you today. And it's marvelous that we have this technology that enables us to do this. I am outside of Washington, D.C., and to be with you in Ontario is wonderful. And I want to start off this morning by sharing with you a photograph. And let's see if we can get this up. Yes, this is my late uncle, Ernest Holman. And I want to dedicate my presentation today to him because he is someone who was so proud of his African Canadian roots. And he's here with our cousin, Barbara K. Smith, who you just mentioned ago, who has done a lot to help bring our families together and to help us enjoy our Canadian history. And I thank you, Barbara, and Uncle Ernie, who passed away this past year at the age of 86. I know you're here with us in spirit, and I hope that that you rest in peace, and I look forward to the day when we'll meet again. All right, and I'm trying to get back to okay, there we go. I'm going to talk about DNA today, and our last speaker, I was very pleased to hear him discuss some of that with you because it's very, very useful for the kinds of things that we need to do to recapture and reclaim our history as African Canadians and as people who are descendants of freedom seekers who escaped from slavery in the United States and who found sanctuary in Ontario. As you know, there's a lot of reasons why we use DNA today. And there's some people that use it primarily to assess health risks and also to have disease treatments that are manufactured or put together in a way that addresses their unique physiology and their unique bodily needs. We see this especially in cancer treatments all across the world now. There also are people who use DNA because they are adopted children and they seek to find who their birth parents are, even if those parents are long deceased. Well, DNA is one of the ways that many, many people are able to reconnect with their birth parents and the history that all of us longs to have. There are other people that use DNA for much more controversial reasons, such as solving cold cases today. And as many of us have grown up with the use of fingerprints to assist us in criminal justice, today we're seeing DNA used more and more for these kinds of purposes. And as I mentioned, it's very controversial, and there's some concerns that many of us have about that. But today, one of the most Widely used reasons many of us DNA test is so that we can learn more about our family histories. And it's especially useful doing that because it can reach across not only the generations, but across the centuries and across the oceans to Africa, to Europe, to all kinds of places where we have roots and maybe don't even know about because of the passage of time. I particularly wanted to learn more about the history of my grandmother. And you see her standing there on the right, and this is her and my grandfather. This is the way I remember them from years and years ago. And my grandmother was an African Canadian, and she was very much interested in her family history and remembering her ancestors who had escaped from slavery. And I have a picture of her as a young woman that I want to share with you as well. I don't know if you can see that. I'm not as good with this technology as some of the other people that have presented. But grandmother grew up in Windsor, and this is a picture of her from the 1910s. Now, her appearance was something that oftentimes caused confusion because people who did not know her sometimes mistook her for a Caucasian. But she wasn't Caucasian, she was a proud African Canadian. But the same things that confused people about her appearance was exactly what enabled her grandmother to escape from slavery from Kentucky to Ontario in 1854. My grandmother's grandmother, her name was America Granderson Pendergrass Thomas. And that's a lot of names, but the reason that we have all of these names is, like a lot of enslaved people, there were different enslavers that kept her enslaved. She started off with a family of enslavers called the Brooks family. And then later there was another enslaver who was connected to the same family, and their last name was Pendergrass. And then Thomas, of course, is her married name. So we have all these different names, and they're very useful to us in terms of tracing the genealogy and also in terms of looking at some of the DNA matches that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. I grew up with the stories of how my grandmother's ancestors escaped from slavery to Canada. But what we weren't told was what happened to the family that she left behind when she escaped. Oftentimes, that's the forgotten part of our history. But that's a very important part of our history because that helps to explain the whole thing about the escape from slavery, why they escaped, why they chose to go where they went, and what happened to the people who remained behind. I wanted to know the answers to those questions. But by the time I began to ask those questions, my grandmother was already deceased. You see, the DNA technology that enabled us to learn so much more really didn't come into widespread usage until after 2005. And particularly at a later point in time with companies such as Ancestry DNA, which is probably the most widely used DNA testing service today for discovering parts of our ancestry. Some of the other companies include 23andMe. There's another company called MyHeritage, a company named Family Tree DNA, and it goes on and on and on. But I have to tell you, my favorite right now is the company known as MyHeritage. It's a company that isn't widely advertised, but it's one of those companies that has become a leader in this whole area of recapturing our ancestry and our family history. And the reason it's so popular with a lot of us is it has specialized tools that enable us to really focus in on that DNA and to also look at the very chromosome segments within our DNA, which we can even identify by race. That's how far the technology has come. And that sort of thing is available not only at MyHeritage, but at 23andMe and also with family tree DNA. But all three of those services give us something that we hope one day Ancestry DNA will do as well, and that is to allow us to look at those chromosome segments that we share with other people who share our DNA and who, as a result, are also related to us through our same ancestors. What I tell a lot of people when they consider DNA testing is to test at as many companies as you can afford, because each of these companies will offer you something unique and something very useful. Ancestry DNA is the most widely known company, the most heavily advertised company, and the company that has the most financial resources. And one of the things that it's particularly useful for is its wide range of documentary sources that you can look at to further learn more about your ancestry. And in fact, this is a company that started off by generating and obtaining and sharing records so that you could trace your family tree. And as the DNA technology got better and better and took off, then Ancestry DNA branched into that area. And now the two things are combined into what most of us know as Ancestry.com or Ancestry DNA. So again, like I said, test it as many companies as you can. And once you decide on a DNA company or several of them, the first thing you have to do is to contact them to get a DNA kit. And they'll send you that through the mail. It doesn't cost a whole lot. In fact, a lot of these companies are always having sales. So if you think it's too much initially, and I think Ancestry DNA typically goes for about $99 US per test, but I've seen it come down to $79, and I believe at one point I even saw it briefly for under $60. So look for the sales. 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA. I've seen all of those companies sell their tests for $79. And again, you can often get those tests for less if you wait until a sale comes out. So you get this DNA kit in the mail. And once you get the DNA kit, what they're going to ask you to do is to either spit into a tube, something very easy to do unless, you know, sometimes people are elderly and that becomes a bit of a challenge. But some of the other companies, such as Family Tree DNA, they will allow you to take a device they give you, which looks like a Q-tip. And you take this Q-tip and you rub it around the inside of your cheek, inside your mouth, and then you take the toothpick and you put it into a solution that's contained in a test tube type of thing. You seal that up. With all of them, you seal up either the saliva or the Q-tip residue, send it in the mail. In a couple of weeks after that, you will receive your results from your DNA test through the internet. And usually it takes only a couple of weeks. If you wait until the holidays, when usually there's a lot of people testing, it can be a little bit shorter. Now I want to see if I can go to another screen here. I want to show you what some of the DNA tests look like, and I hope everybody can see that. This is a copy of the results I got from the company known as 23andMe for my DNA test a couple of years ago. And what this thing does is it shows you all 23 chromosomes, hence the name 23andMe, and it also shows you for each one of your chromosomes that makes up your DNA, the heritage on each of those chromosomes. Red is for sub-Saharan African, blue is for Northern European, the orange is for Native Americans, and so forth. And some people, it gets a lot more colorful than this because you have a lot more ethnic mixes that come together to make the person who they are. But this is just a sample of what you can get from some of these companies. And once you get really good at this, you start matching your DNA to some of the other people that show up as your matches. You can even tune in on the chromosomes where the companies are telling you you match individuals, and you can determine whether the ancestor that you share with that particular DNA match, whether they're of European ancestry or primarily of sub-Saharan African ancestry or Native American ancestry and so forth. So it's very, very, very useful. And 23andMe, I believe, is one of the leaders in providing us with that degree of detail for our DNA results. Now, I like 23andMe because I think their ethnicity predictions are probably some of the most accurate ones that you can get today. But all of the DNA services that I mentioned will give you an ethnic analysis of what your DNA is indicating your heritage to be. Keep in mind, though, that these are just predictions or educated guess by the various companies, because the technology is still rapidly developing. So when you see something on TV that is an advertisement by Ancestry DNA, and it has the man wearing the kilt or something, or the lederhosen, and it tells him that he's this percentage of Scottish and this percentage of Irish or whatever, take that with a grain of salt, because those are only predictions based on the samples that Ancestry DNA has at that particular point in time. Those of us that do a lot of this, what we pay much more attention to is not so much the individual countries that they say are represented in our DNA, but we look more at the continents that they say are represented in our DNA. And we find more and more that that may be a lot more useful to us. Now I want to show you another slide right quick, and bear with me. Again, I am a novice at this technology and I'm kind of learning as I go. But with Ancestry DNA, the biggest thing you're going to get back from them is a long list of people that it says your DNA indicates you are related to. And you see a list here of some of my cousins that are listed as second to third cousins. And I've blanked out the last names for privacy reasons, but Ancestry DNA will do a lot more than that. They will show you your fourth cousins and cousins that are even more distant than that. And you'll get into a lot of names of people that you may not recognize. But it's all very, very useful, because when you click on some of the relatives that you know who show up on your list of matches, such as my cousin William here, then you get more information which takes you to a whole nother realm. And let me be a little more specific. My cousin William here is a little more distant cousin, and we are related because we share my great-great-grandparents as our common ancestors. And those are the only ancestors that we share that are the result of us being cousins. So if I click on William, I'll get something that says shared matches, and that will take me to people who match both William and I in the same way. And that list that is generated is very helpful, because that's your tie-in to the specific ancestors that you're trying to trace. And in this particular instance, the ancestors I'm trying to trace are the ancestors that William and I shared as my great-great-grandparents that I mentioned, who escaped from slavery. So when I got that list and I looked at who William and I shared as cousins, there were a lot of names on that list that I'd never heard of. And one of the people that I saw on that list was a lady named Rachel. Now, I'd never heard of Rachel, and it turns out she only lived 30 miles from where I lived, which at that time was Baltimore, Maryland. And it just seemed odd that I would have a cousin that lived so close to me that I never had heard of. So I reached out to her and I looked at the family tree that she had posted next to her results with Ancestry DNA. And I didn't see an ancestor that connected us. So what I had to do, which is something I often do with these DNA matches that come up on my list, is I looked at her family tree and I began to work on it. And I saw she had an ancestor named Sarah. And I did a little more work through the records, and I have a world membership with Ancestry DNA, which lets me look at records both in the United States and also in Canada, which is critical for the types of things that I was doing. But I can also look into records from Europe and the Caribbean and South America, and there may even be some African records on there at this point, but I haven't seen those yet. But I worked on the family tree for Rachel, and then I got that eureka moment where I realized this is what the DNA is trying to tell me. Turns out that Rachel's ancestor, Sarah, was the daughter of my great-great-grandparents who had escaped from slavery and who had come to Ontario as freedom seekers and found freedom there. So excitedly, I reached out to Rachel, and she answered right back, which isn't always the case, because a lot of times people, you reach out to them on Ancestry DNA and you may never hear from them. And it may be because people are busy, or people are ill, or people aren't really interested in connecting with relatives or tracing their family tree. Sometimes they're more interested just in finding out what it says their ethnic mix is, and that's why they belong to it. And all of that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you get someone like Rachel, who responds quickly and enthusiastically, then you can really get somewhere. And one of the first things that Rachel told me is, she said, you know, I have a grandmother who was living in Washington, D.C. And at that time, she told me her grandmother was age 100. And she said, if anybody knows about our ancestors, it's going to be my grandmother, Margie. And I'd like to arrange a time where we can sit down and both talk to Margie, and she can tell you what she knows. So I was like, you know, I can't wait to do this. I'm having a little trouble bringing up this picture of Margie that I want to show you. Here we go. We're going to get this technology down pat. There's Margie. I hope everybody can see her. And this is when she had her age 100 birthday party that was celebrated 4 years ago, because now she's 104.
Charles, I just want to interrupt to let you know that we can only see the thumbnails, so we're not able to see the full pictures. I don't know if you're double clicking on them, but we can only see the thumbnails. So just
okay,
assume
let me try again. Can you see it now?
Just the thumbnails.
Okay, let's go back to the thumbnail.
Hi, Charles, it's Tom. If you just, if you stop screen sharing and then open up the image before you share, you should see the image itself that you can share, rather than just full.
Okay, well, let's try this one more time. All right, screen share. Can you see the image now?
Yes.
Okay, this is Margie, and this is when she turned 100 a couple years ago. Well, Margie had a photo book that she brought to our meeting, and she sat down with me to go through this photo book, and she was showing me all these relatives that I didn't know I had, most of whom were deceased at this point in time. And as she went through these, she came across an old picture, which was a tintype picture. And some of you are familiar with that. It's a picture that's literally like it says, it's made of tin, and it has an image of someone on it, their photograph. And can you see this new picture now? Is everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, this is one of Margie's pictures. And she told me she couldn't be sure, but she thought this was my great-great-grandfather, Robert Anderson Thomas. And he was one of the ones who escaped with my great-great-grandmother from Kentucky to Ontario in 1854. And of course, this is a much older picture of him because he was in his late teens or maybe his early 20s when he escaped Ontario. And I imagine this picture was probably taken years later, maybe about 1870. And our former speaker mentioned a shipping company and a ship that used to operate on the Great Lakes called the Michigan Steamer. And that was the name also of a boat on which he worked once he was in Canada. And this was a boat or a steamship that basically went up and down the Great Lakes and the Detroit River and so forth. But interesting, like I said, this was one of the photographs that Margie had that I had never seen before. And, you know, it's wonderful when you can get those kinds of things as a result of a DNA match. So anyway, in addition to Rachel, there were other matches that I began to explore. And one of the DNA matches was a lady named Michelle who lived in Ontario, in Ohio. And again, this was someone that I'd never heard of, that I hadn't met. Her last name didn't seem to match up with anybody in my family, but the DNA was indicating we were related. So I looked at Michelle's family tree, which accompanied her DNA results, and I worked on that tree a little bit, and I saw she had an ancestor named Lucinda, but she had no last name for Lucinda. So I went to the records there at Ancestry.com, and I began to research Lucinda. And as I researched her, sure enough, her maiden name appeared, and her maiden name was Granderson. Same last name as my great-great-grandmother's maiden name, Granderson. And of course, back then, when a lot of people had been enslaved, they were prevented by law from learning to read and write. So when they told people their names, oftentimes the person who wrote down those names wrote them phonetically. So sometimes we see Granderson written as Granison, Grannisson. Sometimes Grandison, Grandison, and then sometimes Granderson, which is the spelling my great-great-grandmother used. So as I worked on this and I looked further into Lucinda's background, having her maiden name now, I began to find her family, which was my great-great-grandmother's family. And I also began to not only find them, but I was able to find the people who enslaved all of them. And I was able to find the place where they had grown up enslaved in Kentucky. And then one of the things that really blew my mind was I was able to find a child that my great-great-grandmother had when she escaped from slavery in Kentucky. And I want to tell you a little bit about that story because I learned about it over the course of years and then had it confirmed from the records the DNA led me to. But what I was told back in the mid-1970s from my grandmother, whose picture I showed you a few minutes ago, was my grandmother told me that her grandmother had been enslaved by a very cruel man in Louisville, Kentucky. And he wasn't one of the Brooks families, he was one of their extended relatives. And at that point, my great-great-grandmother had been sold or transferred to him from the Brooks family who had enslaved her originally. Well, at the time my great-great-grandmother was enslaved by this Pendergrass family, she was also in love with my great-great-grandfather, who was also enslaved in Louisville. And the two of them somehow got in touch with sympathetic Quakers who helped them to formulate a plan of escape. And one of the first things the Quakers did, according to my grandmother, was the Quakers arranged for a gentleman to take them across the Ohio River into free states. And I'm not sure if it was Indiana or Ohio, but we just know that he was the one that got them out of Kentucky initially. And once they were out of Kentucky, the Quakers dressed my great-great-grandmother in a black dress with a veil over her face, and they made her look like she was a widow in mourning. And because she was Caucasian looking, with the veil and people being unable to see her face directly, there were few ways they could identify her, which enabled her to escape. They put her on a train, the Quakers, a northbound train, which took her, we believe, to Detroit. Now, my great-great-grandfather, whose picture you saw just a few seconds ago, he was obviously a man of African descent. He didn't look Caucasian, and they couldn't use the same way to disguise him to get him out of the United States into Canada, where he would be free. And this was 1854, a few years after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made it a lot more difficult for freedom seekers to escape from slavery in the South. Anyway, for great-great-grandfather, they told him instead, you're going to have to walk. You're going to have to walk from the Ohio River all the way to Michigan and the border at Detroit, and then we'll get you across the river into Canada. They also told him places where he could stop along the way to refresh himself, to get something to eat, and to hide until it was dark when he could set out again along the route they had given him to escape. Now, he was more fortunate than some of the freedom seekers, which we hear of historically described as fugitive slaves, which is a term I detest because I don't understand why we want to call people fugitives who were seeking only to be free. That doesn't sound like a crime to me. That sounds very American to me, and that sounds like the same sort of principle on which the United States claims to have been founded. But of course, that term goes back to what they called the fugitive slave law. And people who broke that law, who were enslaved, hence were known as fugitive slaves. So anyway, he followed the stops that the Quakers had laid out. He was able to read and write because his slave owners or enslaver's daughter had illegally taught him to read, and he was able to make it to Michigan. And once he got to Michigan, he was reunited with my great-great-grandmother, and they were taken across the Detroit River into Canada, where they were free for the rest of their lives. Now, the story doesn't end there. My grandmother said that her grandmother went back to Kentucky several times and helped other people escape. Her disguise as a young white woman in mourning was very good, and she was able to use it over and over again to go back to Kentucky and help to rescue others. Now, that was a story I was told when I was a teenager by my grandmother in the mid-1970s, but it was about 15 years later when I learned more about what really happened. And I was at a family reunion way down in North Carolina. And I was telling the story, and I thought I was all this and all that because I knew so much, or I thought I knew so much. And during the course of my presentation, an elderly lady that I hadn't seen very often, she'd come to some of the family events, but when you're a kid, you don't pay as much attention to the elderly people as you should, and as you do when you get older. But this elderly relative, she walked over to me and she had a cane, and she took her hand and she placed her hand on my arm. And she said, I know all about that story. And then she proceeded to tell me, I know the reason why your great-great-grandmother kept going to Kentucky. And the reason was when she escaped from slavery, she was forced to leave a child behind. It was a child that she had when she was impregnated by the slaveholder who had treated her so cruelly and who had motivated her to want to escape. Now, she didn't want to leave that child behind, and she couldn't live without the child. So she kept going back to get the child. But the problem was the slaveholder knew she would come back for her child. And so he either moved the child or he sold the child. And each time great-great-grandmother came back, she couldn't get the child. But instead, what she did was she helped to rescue other people who wanted to flee slavery with the help of Quakers who were organized in the area to help bring this about. So that was the story Aunt Mattie, my relative, told me at the family reunion. And I'll tell you, I can't do justice to this story. I can't tell it like Aunt Mattie was able to tell it. And she was able to tell it because she knew the children of my great-great-grandparents. And I think she may have even known my great-great-grandfather. So she was hearing it from sources much closer to it than my grandmother. And there was a passion and a wisdom in what she told me that struck me to my core. And after hearing that story, I had to process, because, with a lot of this stuff, you hear it and, you feel like you know these people as you research them in the records. But when I heard that story, I was hurt. And I had to find a way to make peace with it. So I went across the bridge, went over to Canada, and I searched for my great-great-grandmother's grave in Old Windsor Grove Cemetery near downtown Windsor. And, the records of the cemetery weren't very good back then, and they couldn't tell you precisely where the grave was, so you just had to look. And, I took a whole day off of work and I found the grave. And when I found the grave, I stood there and I fought to keep the tears from forming. And all I could say was, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that the price of your freedom was losing your child. And when you go through something like that, you wish almost that you could reach back in time and do something to stop that situation or to alleviate it. But the strangest thing about it is, as I stood over that grave and softly spoke to the grave, there was a feeling that came over me, a feeling of peace, a feeling that I can't even really put into words other than to say I just felt something there that was comforting, that made me feel it's all right. And I can't say that I heard those words because I didn't hear anything, but I had that feeling that it's all right. And that made no sense to me, none at all, until DNA and years later, when I would discover more of the story. So like I said, I studied Michelle's DNA, and she was my DNA match. I studied her family tree, and I worked on that family tree, and I began to find family members of my great-great-grandmother and her sister Lucinda. And one of those family members, his name was Benjamin. And Benjamin, in the early days of his freedom, did like a lot of people. He tried to, despite his meager earnings, he tried to save some of those earnings for a later day when he knew he would need them. Of course, in those days, we didn't have what's known today as Social Security. So when you became old, you had to either rely on your children or family to take care of you, because oftentimes, as a former slave, you didn't have resources to carry you through. You had to save those. So he saved money in what was called the Freedmen's Bank. And this was a bank that was chartered by the United States government and run by a United States agency known as the Freedmen's Bureau. And there was a record of his deposits there. And on his initial application for his savings account, he listed the names of his parents. Granderson was his father's name. His first name was Darby Granderson. He mentioned his mother's name was Fanny, and he mentioned he had he had 4 sisters and 1 brother. And I thought, okay, now at least I've got the names of my great-great-great-grandparents, the parents of my great-great-grandmother. And I wanted to know if I could find the names of these siblings of Benjamin, because, when you do this kind of stuff, you want to document as much as you can, because you want to be sure when you talk about it that you're telling people that things that are fact-based, not things that are based on supposition or things that may not necessarily be so. So I was looking for additional records that could tell me the names of the brothers and sisters. And I found another man who had the same last name as Benjamin in the same records, and his name was James Granderson. And when I looked at the record for the establishment of James Granderson's account with the Freedmen's Bureau Bank, he listed his brother as Benjamin. So I knew, jackpot, I've got another member of this family. And then I saw that James Granderson in another record was listed as a Civil War soldier. He was one of the over 100,000 African Americans who fought or served the Union Army during the American Civil War, in which slavery was ended. And I should be a little more precise and say the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution ended slavery as a legal situation in the United States. But the Civil War was what many people credit, with good reason, for ending slavery in the United States. So then I thought, I got to get these records to learn more about what this guy did in the Civil War, because I'll be honest with you, I didn't know a lot about African Americans fighting in the American Civil War. When I was a kid growing up in Lansing, Michigan, they didn't teach you that. They taught us that the Civil War was about white men from the North who wanted to free the slaves in the South. And Black people were regarded as passive participants in that epic struggle. But as an adult, I learned that that's not true. That's probably some of the story, but there's a lot more to it. And like I said, there were all these African Americans that fought in that war, and James Granderson was one of them. So I thought, let me take a look at these records and learn about him and learn this history, this family history, which I was never taught in school. Well, there was a lady who lived not far from me, and her name was Angela Walton Raji. And she's a historian in this part of the United States. And one of her specialties is Civil War records. And I reached out to her and she said, you gotta get these records. She made arrangements. She got me the records from the United States Archives, and Lord, behold what those records told. They told me that after James died, his widow had filed for a pension, and in those pension records, there were affidavits of individuals who told about her husband's time as a slave. They told about who the people were who enslaved him, and gave details about all of this that I had never heard before. So, I'm on cloud 9, people. I am at the point where I could just lay down and die, because this is information I had never had. And of course, all of this is stemming from this DNA match to Michelle and the ancestor that she had listed in her family tree. So I decided at that point, let's go deeper. And this historian who was working with me, Angela Walton Raji, she told me, you know what? I bet you I can get you a picture of the people who enslaved your ancestors. And within moments, she did it. And for the first time, I was looking at the people who enslaved my ancestors. Another mind-blowing experience. And as we dug deeper and looked into the records of these enslavers, we found where one of them died in 1846, and his property was probated and distributed to the people who were listed as his heirs. And in those days, people who were enslaved were thought of as property. They were thought of as the most valuable property that an enslaver could have. Imagine that, human beings regarded as property. But the records that were produced from that were phenomenal, because in those records of this man's estate inventory, I found the name of my great-great-grandmother, America Granderson, and I found the name of her sister, Lucinda, and I found their brother, James, her father, Darby, all of them. They were all in that record. And what's interesting here too is this particular slaveholder apparently didn't make the enslaved people that he held, he didn't make them take his last name. He let them hold on to whatever surname they'd had before or that they chose to have. And so we were able to look at our family, know that their name had been Granderson, and that this particular enslaver had not stopped them from using it. And that proved to be extremely valuable as I followed the paper trail forward. Anyway, as you learn this stuff, it's just, you're never satisfied. And what I wanted to do at that point was, I've got to reach out to the descendants of these people who enslaved my ancestors. So in July of 2018, I went looking for them online. And I looked at various family trees and I found them. These people were still in the Louisville, Kentucky area where they and their ancestors had lived since the 1790s. So I reached out to them and I was a little concerned about it because I thought, if my great-great-grandmother escaped from some of these people and their extended family, maybe these weren't very nice people. And even if they were nice people, were they really going to want someone looking at the fact that their ancestors had enslaved other human beings? And those are obstacles that you will sometimes run into when you do this kind of thing. But in my case, I was very, very fortunate. And I'm going to try to do this screen save thing again. Let's see if I can finally get the hang of it. Bear with me for just one quick second here. Okay, we're going to try to open that photograph there. And now we're going to do the screen share, and it's not working. Let's try something else. Can everybody see this photograph?
Just the thumbnails.
Okay, well, we're going to have to try something different.
I think the trick is you have to open the photo first and have it fully up before you share your screen.
Okay, well, I am going to pass by that and we will try that again in a few moments because there's some other photographs that are real important to this that I want to be sure I share with you. But anyway, one of the people I reached out to was a gentleman known as Mike. And I'm not going to give his last name to protect his privacy. And I reached out to him and he answered right back right away. And he said, I was searching around when my grandmother died. We found an old trunk in the attic. And when we opened it, we found there were all kinds of records there regarding the people that our ancestors had enslaved. And he told me that there were copies of bills of sale, rather when the enslaved people were sold, his family had kept deeds that showed those sales and records of what the expenses were that they incurred with the enslaved people and so forth and so on. And he also told me that he was a retired member of the local school board down there, and he understood how important these records were. So he photographed these records previous to the time that I had reached out to him. He'd made a CD of them. He had donated the actual copies of the records to a local historical society, which had an office in the courthouse. And he told me, I'll make a copy of the CD and I'll send it to you. Well, my eyes lit up and I was like, man, can I wait to get this thing? And sure enough, he sent the CD and in a few days I had it and I started going through this thing. And one of the things I saw that knocked my socks off is there was an 1817 deed where my great-great-great-grandfather, Darby Granderson, was purchased by this Brooks family from another family called the Thomas family. And, to see my great-great-great-grandfather described in there as a person who was a slave for life, and to see a dollar value placed on his head, it was a humbling experience, but also a very exciting experience to suddenly see this kind of thing unearthed. So I went through those records and dealt with the emotions that it produced. And a few weeks later, I flew to Kentucky because I wanted to meet this gentleman and I wanted to see the place where all of this had taken place. And this gentleman, Mike, who had sent me the CD, he'd also told me that his cousin still owned one of the plantations or farms where my family had been enslaved. He said the slaveholder's house was still standing. And he told me that the cabin, there were originally 5 cabins where the enslaved people lived. And he said that all except one of those cabins had been destroyed, but they had kept one of the cabins to this day because they used it as a storage shed. So, you know me, I had to get there to meet these people, to walk the grounds of that plantation, and to see this last remaining slave cabin. And, again, I was nervous. I was thinking to myself, you're going down there all by yourself. You don't have any family members with you. You're going to a little plantation or farm, we'd call it today, in the suburbs of Louisville. We got all this stuff going on with President Trump and all these protests all over the United States. Are you sure you know what you're doing? And, you go through that and then something takes over and says, yes, I'm sure I know what I'm doing. I've got to see this. And whatever's protected me to get me to this point in life, which I believe is the good Lord, he's going to protect me and see me through on this part too, because this is one of the things I've been born to do. So I went to Kentucky, I met these people, and lo and behold, they were as nice as they could be. 2 of them were attorneys like myself. The third one that I've mentioned already, Mike, was a retired school board member. And then some of the other ones ran a funeral home business, which strangely enough was located on the plantation where my ancestors had been, which now had become part of suburban Louisville, Kentucky. So I went there, and the first thing you notice is the slaveholder's house. And, it's typical to a lot of what you see with this sort of thing. It's got a porch across part of the front of it and columns, but, not the giant 2-story columns that you see in the movies when they show you plantations. But, essentially it was a large farmhouse. I saw that, they gave me a tour of that, and then they saved for last the slave cabin. And they told me that the cabin, which was made of brick and from the outside, was something that I thought, this looks better than what I've been taught slave cabins usually look like. It was a brick structure. It looked like it had a decent roof on it, and it had a decent door. And of course, I'm looking at this in 2018. There's no telling what it looked like in the mid-19th century. But they opened the door to this place, and, it was small, it was ramshackle, and the first thought was, how could a family live in something so tiny? It was essentially one room with a fireplace, which was still there, which was falling down, a fireplace that wasn't even that large, which I guess was used for heating and also for cooking. And you have to keep in mind, Kentucky is thought of as one of the border states in the United States. So it has both northern and southern elements to it. And one of those elements is in the summertime, it is hot as blazes. And in the wintertime, it's as cold as Detroit and Windsor and many of the places that we know of in Ontario where family members live and where we visited all our lives. And so, to think you're heating a place like this with a little fireplace, and in the summertime, when it's hot as blazes, you got to still deal with all of this, was a little mind blowing. And then I saw the attic to the place, which was so small you couldn't even stand up. And I thought of the children that must have slept in that attic during the years that they were enslaved there. And the people that hosted my visit there, they happened to take a photograph of me coming out of the slave cabin. And I wasn't even aware that somebody was taking pictures. And, in this picture, I'm looking down. And as I saw it, I thought to myself, I remember what I was thinking at that time. I was thinking, how do I make sense of all this? The emotions that it unleashes, the thoughts of your ancestors, my flesh and blood, having lived like this. It's quite an emotional thing that takes you a long time to process. And just walking out of this place, trust me, you can't process it that quickly. It takes weeks. And so looking down at the ground was about the only thing I could do to keep from being lost in my thoughts and emotions. So all of this came as a result of a DNA match. But me, I couldn't stop with that. I had to keep searching. So I kept looking into records regarding my DNA match, Michelle's ancestor, Lucinda, who I just told you about, who was the sister of my great-great-grandmother. And I found her and her husband and their family in the 1870 census for Louisville, Kentucky, Jefferson County, Kentucky. And as I looked down that list, I saw the name of a young man, his wife, and I think maybe one or two kids. And his name was different from Lucinda's married name, which was Field. And it didn't match with any of them. And guess what the last name was? The last name was Pendergrass. The last owner, or I shouldn't say owner because I hate that term too. I hate that term too, but the last enslaver of my great-great-grandmother from whom she'd escaped. And I thought, wait a minute, is this the child she left behind? Same last name. And I looked at it more closely and I saw he differed from the other people in the household. He was listed as an M next to his name, which was the designation they used for mixed race people. In those days, they used the term mulatto, which is something that many of us detest. It isn't used to this, today, but that was the term they used back in those days to describe mixed race people. So he's coming across as different from the rest of the people in the household. And then they had him listed as not one of the children, of this couple, Lucinda and her husband, William. They had him instead listed as I believe, a stepchild. And I thought, oh, I think I got something here. And I looked at the date of his birth, which was during the time that my great-great-grandmother was enslaved by this Pendergrass gentleman in Louisville, from whom she later escaped. So I looked at it some more and I began to branch out into other records. And I found this guy, his name was Elisha Pendergrass. I found that he was employed both as a carpenter and as a teacher of a school that the United States government opened for African-American children in the days after slavery. And in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau of the United States government, we find records of his payment and his class sizes and so forth. And the 1867 records tell us that he was a teacher in Louisville, and lo and behold, one of the first teachers of African descent of newly freed people in the town of Louisville. And I followed him on in other records. And of course, like great-great-grandmother America who escaped to Canada, I came to the conclusion and the understanding that, like her, he was very Caucasian in appearance. And indeed, as the years passed and the Freedmen's Bureau passed out of existence, he decided to eventually leave Kentucky. And he left there to become a rancher on the western frontier in Colorado. And when you look at the later records for him there, you find that he changed his race in the records. He went from being a mixed race person to someone who identified as Caucasian. And of course, in those days, if people didn't know you, they believed you were whatever you said you were. And of course, today, in contrast to the prevailing belief back then, which is if you had one drop of African ancestry, you were forever a Black person. Today, we realize that race is a social construct, that there's no such thing as race. It's something that we have created to describe people and to separate people, and that has been a basis for the treatment or mistreatment of people in North America for as long as Europeans and Africans have shared this continent with indigenous peoples. But he decided in his official records to live as a Caucasian. And you see something like that and you begin to realize there are a lot of people that did that. But your first thought is, that's kind of a shame that you have to do that. But then as you begin to research it and you realize that he's one of the few people of African descent to live in his community on the frontier, that probably it was better for him to adopt that racial designation. And it was probably a way of survival, a way of just trying to make it. And indeed, as I searched the records further, that looks like precisely what it was. I found that there was a situation that occurred in 1901 where he was involved in an altercation with a white gentleman who was also a rancher in a dispute over the borders of their particular ranches. And the white gentleman sought to assault him and sought to take great-great-uncle Eli's horses. And at that point, to defend himself, great-great-uncle Eli shot the man. He didn't kill him, but he wounded him, and he put a stop to what the gentleman was trying to do to him. Well, anyway, there was a trial that followed it. And of course, nobody on the frontier suspected that he was anything other than a Caucasian. So there's every indication that the trial he received was a fair one, in contrast to the type of trials that we see in many places, especially in the American South, where a person of African descent is accused of assaulting a white person. In contrast, great-great-uncle received a fair trial and was acquitted, and the papers said that he was an honorable gentleman and so forth. And I believe I'm probably going over my time. We got started rather late. And so I'm going to try to wrap this up as quickly as I can. And I see Irene nodding at me, and I appreciate her doing that. Because as you can see, I could go on and on and on with this. But DNA was so valuable to me. Without the DNA match, I probably would have never known all of this. And of course, that sense of peace that I mentioned that I felt at my great-great-grandmother's grave, it all made sense now. Because the child that she was separated from when she sought to become free, after slavery was over, was reunited with her family in Louisville. And there's every indication he was reunited with her too. I'm going to stop now, but I want to briefly mention that as we followed the DNA further, we found links to other people who lived in Buxton, Raleigh Township. We found that there was an Edward Granderson, who was also an escaped former slave who found freedom first in the Queens Bush settlement of Ontario, and then eventually in Raleigh Township. His name was Edward Granderson. He had a daughter named Martha Ann Granderson, who is buried at the cemetery there in North Buxton. And she married a guy named Solomon Zeb Jr. And they had descendants. And lo and behold, one of their descendants took a DNA test, and that descendant is indeed matching my relatives to this day. So people, I tell you, if you can do it, if you can swing it, take that DNA test. It can open up doors for you like nothing else can. It can take you on a journey that begins with your spit and ends with things that you will find that will blow your mind. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to talk about something I so much enjoy. And thank you, Irene and Barbara, for reaching out to me and allowing me this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Charles. And I mean, it's clear from the comments, people have really been moved and inspired by your wonderful work and your storytelling. There are some questions about whether you're going to be publishing this work in the form of a book.
Well, you know, I've gotten asked that question through the years, and I have to say that's something I really want to do. Now, unfortunately, I'm a practicing attorney. I'm a civil rights attorney in the Washington, D.C. area. And when you commit yourself to that type of practice, you don't make a lot of money. You'll never grow rich. So anyway, it's my hope to be able to retire in a few years. And I'm hoping this is something that I'll be able to do in just a couple of years when I'm able to do that retirement and have the time to put this in book form. And if you know of anybody that wants to collaborate with me in writing this book, I'm all ears.